The most influential hypotheses and the most long-lasting included one that said that fires fed by diesel fuel tanks within the building were responsible for generating extraordinary heat. The New York Times reported that massive structural beams that functioned as a sort of bridge to hold up the 47-story Building 7 were compromised in a disastrous blaze fed by diesel fuel, leading to the building's collapse, investigators have concluded in a preliminary report. That article from the New York Times was not exactly accurate. They were reporting on the FEMA report for Building 7, which did not reach conclusions. And although the report suggested that diesel fuel might have played a role, it also said that this best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. So basically, FEMA said that loss of structural integrity was caused by fires on the 5th to 7th floors. That's important because that changed as well. The specifics of the fires and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time, although the total diesel fuel in the premises contained massive potential energy, and the best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence. They were supported by popular media, Popular Mechanics specifically, which said that investigators believe the fire was fed by tanks of diesel fuel. You may know that this book by Popular Mechanics is often referred to by people who are supporting the official story. And Scheim Sunder, who was mentioned before, said our current working hypothesis is that this pressurized line was supplying fuel to the building and the fire for a long period of time. Although this hypothesis was promoted for years, neither the diesel fuel nor the transfer girder failure made it into the final theory. Diesel fuels were not the cause, as NIST said. Diesel fuel fires did not play a role in the collapse of Building 7. Damage from the falling Tower 1 was also not the cause. That was often referred to. Other than initiating the fires in Building 7, the damage from the debris from Tower 1 had little effect on initiating the collapse of Building 7. And again, the design of the building over the Conn substation with the transfer gate girders you see in the diagram below, that was also not the cause. What scientists and forensic investigators usually do is look for evidence. We know that there was no precedent for such an event, but what evidence do we have for a fire-based theory? Unfortunately, most of the physical evidence was destroyed, and NIST said that no steel samples from Building 7 were available for its investigation. That was not true, and we'll see that. Additionally, NIST collected thousands of photos and videos from the public over a period of years and kept them hidden from the public. They've only recently released some of those. We also have documents that establish the fire resistance plan for the building, and that is important evidence related to a fire-based theory. Important evidence also could have been gained through physical testing of steel components. Unfortunately, no such testing was done, despite the fact that the testing would have been relatively easy and straightforward. In the end, this theory was based entirely on computer modeling. As we see here, the U.S. House Committee on Science reported on the destruction of the steel evidence. They said in the month that lapsed between the terrorist attacks and the deployment of the FEMA team, a significant amount of steel debris was removed from the rubble pile, cut into smaller sections, and either melted at the recycling plant or shipped out of the U.S. Some of the critical pieces of steel were gone before the first FEMA team member ever reached the site. This unprecedented destruction of evidence continued throughout the cleanup effort, even when the investigators were there. A good question that remains unanswered is why did official investigators, including the National Institute for Standards and Technology, not follow the national standard for fire investigation? Part of the standard, which is called NFP 921, states that it is essential to prevent the destruction or removal of evidence. That may seem obvious to most of us. Removal of the evidence may have had something to do with the nature of the evidence itself. NIST told us that not one piece of steel from this huge building was left for its investigation. But that was not true, as I said. This sample was photographed by a professor from the University of California in Berkeley. He had been granted access to areas near Ground Zero through a National Science Foundation project. He examined a number of unusual samples as early as 1 week after 9/11. And this sample looks like it has some odd burns or cuts in the steel, and that same professor later stated that he saw melted girders at the World Trade Center. When the official FEMA investigators were finally admitted to the site, they found some very unusual samples of steel. The New York Times reported on perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. This mystery referred to thin pieces of steel discovered by FEMA investigators that were found to exhibit sulfidation and evidence of a eutectic formation that could not be explained by any of the Firewise professors. They had never seen it before. A eutectic formation is a chemical mixture that melts at a lower temperature than its individual components. In this case, it was a mixture of iron, oxygen, and sulfur. The FEMA investigators reported that the severe corrosion and subsequent erosion of samples 1, which was from Building 7, and 2, are a very unusual event. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. The rate of corrosion is also unknown. A detailed study into the mechanisms of this phenomenon is needed. Additional photos from the FEMA report are here. It was reported that a 1-inch steel column had been reduced to 1/2-inch thickness. Its edges, curled like a paper scroll, have been thinned to almost razor sharpness. Gaping holes let light shine through a formerly solid steel flange. And the Swiss cheese appearance shocked all the Firewise professors who expected to see distortion and bending, but not holes. The detailed study recommended by these Firewise professors in FEMA never got done, and NIST never mentioned any of this mystery in its final report. And although this presentation will not go into detail on it, independent scientists have proposed answers through a series of peer-reviewed scientific articles which you can find online. The NIST investigation began just after the publication of the FEMA World Trade Center report in May 2002. The investigation proceeded for 2 years until 2004, when NIST decided to decouple its report on Building 7 from its investigation into the towers. In any case, we can say that the NIST investigation into Building 7 proceeded for at least 5 years, from 2002 to 2004, and then from 2005 to 2008. This is despite NIST's claim that its investigation lasted for only those final 3 years. At some point during the 6-year period between NIST's charter and its final report on Building 7, the objectives seemed to change. Originally, the specific objective of the NIST investigation for Building 7 was to explain why and how Building 7 collapsed. Then later, NIST said the challenge was to determine if a fire-induced floor system failure could occur in Building 7 under an ordinary building contents fire. Now, this suggests that NIST started with assumptions and that they were going to try to prove a fire-based theory, regardless of what they found. By December 2003, investigators had obtained a great deal of information on the building. And their report said that hypotheses have been postulated for the collapse of the building. NIST is analyzing these and other possible structural collapse sequences as part of its investigation. Detailed mappings for the fires and so forth are underway for Building 7. And as I said, NIST had also started gathering thousands of photos and videos, which they effectively kept away from the public. In June 2004, NIST published an interim report on Building 7. And they presented what they called a working hypothesis. It was basically the diesel fuel fire idea, the truss girders in floors 5 through 7, if it holds up upon further analysis. NIST might have wanted to gloss over its first 2 years of investigation into Building 7 because it did not want to acknowledge some of the things, ultimately, in its 2004 interim report that contradicted its final report. At the time of the 2004 interim report, NIST was still looking at many different hypotheses. None of these hypotheses, or any of NIST's earlier reports, had much to do with the final theory, and none of them had anything to do with explosives. Shocking admission was made 2 years after the 2004 interim report by NIST lead investigator Shyam Sunder, who made it clear that they had little or no idea what happened to Building 7 at that time. This is very startling in the fact that, and by 2006, construction had been completed on a new Building 7 that was placed in the exact same location. It was 52 stories tall. It took 4 years to complete, and we still didn't know what happened to the first one. But this was 4 years after NIST began its investigation. So again, as Professor Graham pointed out, we should wonder how anyone could have predicted this building would collapse, given that 4 years into the investigation, government scientists had no idea how it happened. But NIST suddenly told us in 2008 that it was all obvious and that science was behind it. We're going to take a close look at this final theory and discover for ourselves whether or not it's obvious. NIST final reports for Building 7 came out in 2008. These were NIST NC Star 1A, the final report, and NIST NC Star 19, the supportive documentation, larger reports behind them. These can be found online at wtc.nist.gov, and they are about 900 pages in total. So please do look at them. They're not quite as large as the report for the towers. But here's the gist of the overall theory that NIST proposed. Fire-induced thermal expansion of the floor system surrounding column 79 led to the collapse of floor 13, which triggered a cascade of floor failures. In this case, the floor beams on the east side, actually on the northeast corner of the building, expanded enough that they pushed the girder spanning between columns 79 and 44 to the west on the 13th floor. This movement was enough for the girder to walk off its support at column 79. The lower left diagram is kind of a depiction of what they're trying to say there, and how NIST envisions the girder being pushed by a beam. And the result was that the unsupported girder and other local fire-induced damage caused floor 13 to collapse, beginning a cascade of floor failures down to the 5th floor. I'm not going to actually talk about that. We'll leave that to Tony. But the diagram on the lower right is a depiction of that, with the column, the critical column, being left unsupported and then buckling. So one thing we might begin with is, since NIST collapse initiation sequence begins with thermal expansion, and to be more specific, linear thermal expansion of the floor beams, we must ask, is thermal expansion a new phenomenon, as NIST has implied? The answer is absolutely not. Thermal expansion is well known, and its effects on building components have been tested. One well-known series of tests occurred in the UK at the Cardington Fire Test Facility. Tests done at Cardington under severe fire conditions showed that floor beams will deflect downward in response to thermal expansion. This is particularly true because the floor beams are made composite with the floor assemblies, as we'll discuss. And this means that shear studs are used to attach the beams to the floors and make them one piece. Without the studs, the beams could also deflect laterally or sideways to relieve the stress of expansion. So what does NIST say happened in Building 7? Here's a photo of the area showing the critical column, column 79. NIST says fires on floor 12 heated the ceiling that included the floor beams for floor 13, causing thermal expansion of the beams, which pushed the girder at column 79 off its seat. And from there, everything just fell apart. You can see the girder here with its seat and the floor beams that are connected to it.